Welcome again to another Overwatch League team preview. Joining me one more time is Sideshow, Overwatch analyst, writer for Over.gg, and, of course, TF2 caster, former TF2 caster, and expert on that scene. So we're going to be discussing the Boston Uprising as our next team in this series. Now, this is a team that is quite unusual. So this team is owned by the Kraft family, who owns the New England Patriots and the Revolution, which is the Major League Soccer team in America. So they're coming from a background of a lot of sports prestige, a lot of money, a belief in that the system that they have created creates championship caliber teams. And so to them, especially important are the people who run their organization. And to that end, they hired the former StarCraft 2 pro gamer who has won an MLG championship in the past, Huck, to organize this team. Now, Huck came into the Overwatch scene early on, started doing some analyst work on the desks. You may have seen him at E-League, and then transitioned into working with a team called Toronto Esports, of which some of the players on Boston Uprising have followed him to this new roster. Now, Huck has said specifically that their goal is to find the most coachable players and not necessarily the top tier star players that we would have expected somebody like the Kraft family to sign. So a lot of fans, when this roster was announced, were quite perplexed, partially because it looked like the announcement video was made in like Windows Movie Maker. And it looked terrible, but partially because there were a lot of no names on here. It was a bit of a strange conglomeration of players that ended up on Boston. But as we saw in the preseason, they actually did better than most people have expected. They did lose to the NYXL 3-1, but then they beat the Shanghai Dragons 3-2. And even though the Shanghai Dragons are not going to be the best team in the league, no doubt about that, and we expected New York to win considering the strength of their roster, but they still showed some like weird strengths that give you a lot of confidence, I think, if you're looking down the line at this team. So even though they lost and then they barely scraped out a win, I think most people would agree that they probably look like they have a pretty high ceiling despite their sort of rocky preseason performance. What were your main takeaways about Boston as a team?
Well, the roster itself, when it was announced, is a massive risk, I think, because a lot of these players are or some of these players are, in a sense, hidden gems. People didn't value them, and the staff picked them out of, a lot of them out of the Korean scene, 4 of the players out of the Korean scene. And it's always a risk whether they'll actually hit the potential that you think you see in them. But in terms of an individual level, in terms of their mechanics and how they were playing in the game, it seemed like all of their players were actually playing really well in the preseason. And I think Boston were playing like they had something to prove as well. And they did get utterly destroyed by New York Excelsior on a number of maps. But I think in general, the takeaway was that Boston Uprising are incredibly hungry and have some good mechanical players that are hitting somewhere close to their ceilings in terms of like how they're actually individually performing, and just need some work on the overall gameplay.
So when I was watching the preseason, the takeaways I have, so they did take a map off of New York, which was the control map. So we've seen them in sort of these deathmatch modes look pretty good at even be able to challenge top players. So what does that say to us? Okay, well, their mechanics are actually pretty good on this roster. It's just their teamwork and coordination and their sort of game plan, like their plays going in, their set plays were weak. When I also took a look at the stats coming out of these games, they had a lot of individual kills, but let's put it this way: like the percentage of eliminations to like final blows that a player like Striker has was pretty close, and they were not focus firing on targets or like selecting targets very well. So it was a lot about the space that each individual player, particularly their DPS, could create, rather than everybody getting an elimination by firing on one target. It was like Striker getting getting an elimination because he also got the final blow, and he was the only one, or one of 2 people maybe focusing that target.
Yeah, I think the thing with Boston Uprising as well is that they have a lot of players that can be very good, but they don't have any core from a previous team. They don't have any set system at the moment. They've got to be building that. The coaching staff hasn't worked together previously as well, and so they're kind of knitting all of these different pieces into a team that they've taken a bit of a gamble on, and they'll just have to see where they end up by the end of it. But they don't look like they're going to completely fall on their face. They look like they're going to slowly develop over the course of the season, I think.
Yeah, you wouldn't have this team as bottom of the barrel at, they're probably like three. I think we would say there are three teams worse than them right now, which, considering their roster when they were announced, is actually quite impressive. Now, from inside information, like, I can tell you that a lot of teams are respecting them because they're practicing harder than anyone else right now. They tend to have more scrim blocks scheduled, so they're definitely like have a strong work ethic, which I think is what Huck was looking for when he built this team. Now, their flaws, when we saw them play against New York, they tended to do the same thing over and over and over again. So it's like, if you watch them play on a payload map or an assault map, you tend to see them just sort of have the same defense or the same attack every single time. And especially on defense, they have like one formation that they use. It may work once, but then it got figured out by New York, and then it just got utterly destroyed. And also, when their defense fails, like we saw them play well on Dorado up until the point where their defense cracked, and then they just got wrecked the entire rest of the map. Like, they don't know how to reset after their defense fails, so it's like they play well when they know what to do, but once they get figured out, they can't improvise anymore. They can't reset properly on that defense any longer, and it looks pretty sloppy.
Yeah, they look like a brand new team that's been formed from pretty decent players, but really doesn't have game plans going into every point and ability to adapt on the fly, because it's not just that every person needs to know how to adapt to what they're seeing, but you have to all adapt in the same way, in order to coordinate a response to whatever the enemy team is throwing at you. And that just comes with time. And that comes with time of being able to grind through maps. And it looks like they've got the grinding aspect down, if we're to believe that they've got all these coachable players and they're really knuckling down for the season. But they've got really quite a long way to go in terms of their macro gameplay if they want to be able to finish in the top half of the Overwatch League, I think, which, if you have players like this and you're really trying to build a system, maybe they're going for a longer kind of they're thinking more long term than just over the first season. But we'll have to see how it develops, because at the moment they do look very much like a brand new team.
Yeah, absolutely. All right, so let's start breaking down these players. Let's start with their main tank, because this is a player that most people are probably going to know who come from League of Legends, which is a player named Gamsu. And Gamsu is the same Gamsu that used to be a backup player for Samsung when they were on their championship run in 2014. He then was the top laner for Dignitas in America. He then was the top laner for Fnatic in Europe. And then he transitioned into being an Overwatch player in Korea starting in Apex Season 1 as the tank for a team called Conbox. So this is a guy who's now lived in America, Europe, obviously a native Korean who's back in America again, has pretty decent English from his stints in the West, has been a pro player on multiple teams and multiple games now. So I think he really is sort of the heart of this team, because he's the veteran player. He's got the most experience by a long shot. And he's very consistent as a tank. And even when he was on Conbox to talk about his Overwatch career, his team was mediocre in Apex, like sort of, they were a mid-tier team a lot of the time, but he was a standout player on that roster, and he's actually shown that he's probably pretty equally good at Reinhardt and Winston, and even in the games that we saw in the preseason, he was going off a lot of the time. Like, when you talked about diamonds in the rough earlier, he really looked like the best player on this Conbox team, and you can sort of see that reflected now that he's on Boston.
Yeah, Conbox was a weird one as well, because they were always the team that other people in Korea were a little bit scared of, didn't want to pick them in the bracket, and thought that they had upset potential, but never actually achieved anything. I think one of the big reasons for that is because they had a team that worked okay. They had a few individually talented people that kind of cycled throughout the seasons, but Gamsu stayed. But they never really had well-executed game plans. They never went into something really knowing their opponent. They ran their own kind of weird cheese strats at times and really tried to make one player carry the team. It was a weird one, Combox. And so I think Gamsu now is perhaps in a position where he feels he doesn't have to rely on kind of cheese strategies or short-term success in terms of Apex being a tournament that ran every couple of months. He can now look to build a system within the team that he can play really well with it. So I think this is going to be where Gamsu shows that he's much better than the results that he's had in his previous Overwatch history.
Yeah, I agree with you. And so let's move into the flex tanks, because those are the people who are going to be supporting Gamsu on this. And one of them is Kalios, who's coming over from Africa Freaks, who is a very good Zarya player in Korea. One of the better Zarya players, in fact, and another, I think, underappreciated sort of potential like rising star that we saw in the Korean scene that just wasn't on the right team at the right time to really make the best use of him.
Yeah, Kalios played actually in a Korean team that dominated the Chinese scene for a while, that went over there and was easily the best team in China, called WNV Korea. And that was when he was playing the Zarya and just destroying everybody over there. Got, I think, to 5K SR as well. So a fantastic performance in the solo queue, as well as being really great within his team, and then came over to Africa Freaks after that team fell apart, and played really well on the diva role as well. So Kalios is a big pickup that was announced at the beginning of the season, and not many people were expecting it. You know, hints and rumors go around about these teams before they're announced, and people didn't realize that Kalios had been picked up for Boston Uprising. And I think that makes a big difference to the team, because if you've got a Korean tank duo, rather than having to have the other Canadian guy is the off tank. And so if you have a Canadian and a Korean trying to work out with some tank synergy, perhaps there's going to be some communication issues or breakdowns in play. But I think if you've got two Koreans as the core of your team in the tanks, that can work pretty well for Boston.
So Note, as you mentioned, is the Canadian off tank who came from Toronto Esports over to the Boston roster. He's relatively unknown. I mean, Toronto Esports was a really minor Overwatch team, amateur team that we didn't see a whole lot of outside of contenders qualifiers. So what do you think about Note? Because he was playing a lot of Diva. He looked like a decent supporting tank player, but not anything like super special from what we've seen. Solid, but not amazing.
Yeah, I mean, I don't even know that much about him, because, as you say, he was playing for such a comparatively low-level team. This is somebody that this is a team that didn't quite make it into really the tier 2 competition of contenders in North America. Played in the team as they were trying to get into that position, and just looked like he was a reasonably good Diva player. So this was another one of the question marks on the roster for me when it was announced, is like, why is this guy been picked up? Have they seen that he's incredibly coachable and really intelligent? Has he got great calls? Is he got a massive amount of flexibility? I don't think we really know yet, because he's just been playing the Diva role. So I think for me, it would be odd if they fielded him above Kalios, and that would make me interested to see why he's on this roster.
Yeah, I think we just need more information on this guy, because there's just not a lot out there right now. Let's transition to the DPS role. So one of the first players that they picked up was a Russian Tracer player called Mistakes, that they picked up from an amateur team that was in European contenders that was doing quite well with him, called 123. So Mistakes impressed a lot of people with his pretty great Tracer play throughout the season. We didn't get to see much of him actually in the preseason, because he has been replaced in that role sort of by a guy named Striker, a Korean player named Striker, who was another like mystery player that sort of came out of nowhere and started doing really well. But Mistakes, they have these two Tracer players, and Mistakes right now seems to be the secondary one, but we still know he's pretty damn good.
I'm very confused, actually, as to why they have just decided to pick up two Tracer players and kind of leave them in that situation, because Mistakes is a very flexible guy. He previously played with a Russian team before he kind of formed his own team, which ended up being one of the best in Europe. And as he went through that transition, he changed his role. He took on a leadership role. He was making some calls for the team. He was making them knuckle down and really gave them this kind of dedicated approach. So I think he's one of the guys that Boston's picked up with a great mentality, but also the flexibility to be able to put him on things other than Tracer. And so I don't understand why Boston would just have two overlapping Tracer players, and I assume that throughout the season one of these will end up diversifying so that they don't overlap as much with their hero pools, because at the moment Striker and Mistakes are playing pretty much the same role, and they're both just about as good as each other. Potentially Striker has a bit of a higher ceiling on his play, but they're both really quite incredible, and I think Mistakes has the more flexibility or ability to broaden his hero pool, so I would expect to see Mistakes on other stuff throughout the season as well, I think.
Yeah, and maybe they just need more time for him to practice again on some of these other heroes, which is why we may not have seen him play as much. But yeah, he definitely started out, and we mostly saw Striker during the preseason with just a little bit of mistakes. But for all we know, that's happening and could happen in the future. But to go to Striker, so Striker's a Korean player who is coming over from the Rocks Orcas, which is a team that probably not a lot of people saw because they spent a long time in Apex Contenders. Or Apex Challengers, the sub league, to Apex before getting into Apex and then not doing that great in the league. But he came over and he was making some incredibly impressive like solo kills on a lot of players on the teams on their opposing teams in the preseason. He sort of was not working very well with the rest of the team, possibly communications issues. He was sort of off, like doing his own thing a lot of the time, but he was effective at what he was doing.
Yes, he's got very good mechanical skill, and particularly when you actually saw him play with Boston Uprising as well in the preseason, he still maintained that kind of style where he's going off and playing more on his own. But that's a perfectly reasonable style if you want to play a Tracer like that. There's a lot of real high-level Tracers with big mechanical skill that do that. Get behind the team, try and get picks on their support line, push up, put pressure from the back, and force them to move forwards into your team. And Striker seems to like to play that style. He also has some off picks. He's picked up McCree, and I think he picked up Hanzo as well for the team when we saw them playing in the preseason. He's a guy with a big ceiling, and I think they picked him up as another one of these diamonds in the rough, but he's much less proven than Gamsu is. He really only came up this season in the past couple of months for Rocks Orcas. He's only really played one hero so far at a premium level, and it wasn't like he was utterly destroying and carrying his team when he was playing over in Korea. He was putting up impressive numbers, but they weren't like unbelievable numbers. So I think he's not going to be the next best.
But he was
player
also
in the
on
world.
A bad team, so
yeah, that's true. Yeah, but he was playing kind of more of an individual style as well, I think. So I don't think he's going to be another caliber for like you found the next best Tracer in the world, but I do think he's going to be a very good Tracer if they can tame him within the style of Boston Uprising.
So the most consequential, let's say, player that is going to be playing the DPS role, at least from what we saw in the preseason, is Dream Casper, and that's because so much is being asked of him because they have these like two Tracer players, and then Dream Casper has to play like literally every other DPS hero apparently. He was on Tempo Storm, so again, like a pretty minor player, but he showed up some big Genji plays in the preseason. He showed some decent Pharah play. He seems flexible, but I guess I'm just concerned about how much this guy is going to be expected to shoulder on this team.
Yeah, he seems to be the guy that they're building the entire team around in terms of their attacks, and like they want him to be their star player. Even though they've got two very good Tracer players on the ground, he's going to be their main focus for who the tanks are setting up and where their ultimates are going for the attacks, it seems. And that's weird because Dream Casper doesn't have a history of being a top player. He doesn't have a history of big performances on previous teams. He has a history of being in the kind of up and coming or tier 2, 3 teams and being a pretty good DPS player on those. As you're saying, really big flexibility. Actually seems to have worked pretty well within their system for the preseason, but there's a huge amount of pressure on this guy's shoulders, and we don't have any idea of where his ceiling might be. So that's another reason why I think they definitely need to work to diversify between striker and mistakes to take some of the pressure off Dreamcasper, so that they don't just have him as their Swiss Army knife, that they're expecting to get big performances from Dreamcasper every time, because the guy is not going to be able to put up these kind of consistent performances all the time and really come out with the big plays for the team.
Yeah, and I think with Dreamcasper too, my concern is that from watching him, because I have tools that a lot of, I could see like the top down like map overview view every time, like during the games that I'm watching when I'm casting or when I'm on the desk. And my concern about him is that he always stands in the same places in the maps over and over and over again. So he in particular, even though he has mechanical skill, he becomes extremely predictable as to where he's going to go. And smart players are just going to expect him to be in one place every time. I saw that very clearly in the New York games that they played against, where it just got easier and easier and easier for Pine to kill him. So I do have a bit of concern that he needs to be a little trickier in his play, or try and introduce some level of unexpected play or more tactics in there. Could be a team thing, because for all we know, because if Boston has this problem as a group, they've been told, okay, we're going to run this one play over and over and over again. We're going to drill this until we get it right, and that's all they've got right now until they get further along in the season.
Yeah.
Let's talk about the supports, because this is probably the weirdest part of Boston is their support roster. It's I think we can agree the weakest part of their roster. If we had to pick one position, tank, DPS, or support, we'd say supports are the weakest part of this team. They also have 4 of them, so they have more players. So maybe somebody's going to step up here. But it is a bit odd, particularly because they have 2 Lucio players in Avast and Kelix. So let's start with Kelix, who's a Danish player that used to play for the Danish team Singularity and is now over on Boston.
Yeah, he was always very well known within the European scene for being a very mechanically gifted Lucio, very aggressive, is going to be excellent at being able to dodge enemy dives and follow up on his own team's dives, to be able to output damage and make sure that he finishes off kills and stuff like that, which isn't a role that you see many Lucio players doing. But for me, whenever I've watched him, and certainly when I watched him extensively play for Singularity, which was this Danish team, there were 2 big question marks for me. One was that he never really seemed to apply this to be able to give the same level of support to his support partner, because he was very aggressively minded or self-minded, as in he was trying to dodge the attacks himself and trying to apply pressure himself, rather than most Lucios, the kind of de facto way to play is to try and help your support partner because they have more impact than you overall. Didn't see too much of that from Kelix. And the other thing is that he doesn't call as much from what I've heard. He's much more of a quieter player, kind of more focused on his own gameplay. And so they'll be looking to Avast for that kind of play.
Yeah, I was going to say, that's the contrast right there. Is Avast is the very vocal player who
but not the
who's known
skilled.
Yeah, but who's known for his like game knowledge, right, and his ability to communicate in game.
But you can't play 2 Lucios, unfortunately, in Overwatch.
Not anymore. Thank God. But both of these guys didn't look comfortable in the current meta. When we have Zenyatta Mercy, I wasn't too thrilled with like what we saw from these guys. Certainly, we did see them play a little bit of Lucio in some of these control maps, and like they looked better, but it was a bit off-putting, I have to say.
Yeah, I think this has been a shot of the Lucio mains. As I said, they've been able to play Lucio for a year and a half, pretty much, and haven't had to switch off to anything else. And so now it's they have to bring something else to the team in terms of their calling or something like this. And the fact that Avast is probably a big leadership role within the team in terms of the calling and the way that he's going to set up plays and stuff like that. Makes me wonder what they're going to do in terms of fielding him or Kelix for games, because Kelix, I think, is undoubtedly the better Lucio of the 2, and probably going to be the better support player if Lucio ends up going out of the meta. But Avast might bring some more intangibles to the team that are actually just better to have him in the lineup. But either way you cut that, it's like you're sacrificing something very important for another very important thing. You can't have both on the roster in that particular role.
And it'll be interesting to see whether Avast eventually just becomes a coach.
Yes, I mean that could definitely be a situation. Whether he's doing that from an official position or as a player from the bench, you might find out, halfway through the season when Avasta's barely been on the team at all, that he's been the player that's had the biggest impact in how they actually have been performing, because he could be taking on more of the coaching or like breaking down micro plays or something within the team. It's definitely a role that I think he could fill.
So now we're going to talk about Nako. So Nako is a Korean player who's coming over from the RX Foxes. Now, out of all of the players on this roster, technically Nako is the most accomplished because the Foxes got 4th place in Apex Season 4. So this is a team that, again, rose out of the amateur scene in Korea to actually place pretty highly in Apex. Still, though, this guy... He seems like a little bit shaky to me. I don't know if it's communication issues coming over from his former team, but there was nothing really flashy that we saw from him in the preseason.
No, I think he's just a fairly solid support player. Support players are quite difficult to find as well. If you want to find good support players, you have to go digging for them after everybody else has snatched them up for Overwatch League. So I think Neko, because of his relationship with one of their coaches, Krusty, who I believe is a head coach, a Korean guy, he was the guy who ran RX Foxes, who Neko played for. I think probably spotted that he had the ability to play within the team and was a good enough support player to add in there, because otherwise that was a role that was massively lacking, I think, with Boston Uprising. They needed somebody to bring some stability to that role. I think Neko can definitely provide it. He's not going to be the guy that goes off or that they put a lot of resources onto to really succeed, but I think he can be a solid Overwatch League level support player for them.
And that concludes with Snow, who's another Toronto esports player. He's an Ethiopian player, American immigrant, very, I would say, shaky, like sort of below standard Mercy play that we saw from him in the preseason.
Yeah.
We don't really know a lot about this guy, again, because like Note, Toronto Esports is not an organization that we actually saw much time from, but somebody that Huck felt very strongly had a high upside.
Yeah, and that must be some kind of intangibles or what Huck's seen from actually watching his gameplay, because when you watch Snow play, or even when you take a look at his stats, both are underwhelming as an outsider looking in. So perhaps this guy doesn't get playtime over Neko at the moment because Neko was kind of a late signing for the team. So maybe Neko just comes in and full on replaces Snow. But it's more likely that that Huck, I think, has seen something probably, as he likes to say, coachable out of Snow, where he feels like he can develop him into a good player and add another element where they can go over to perhaps Snow and Neko if they want to run some kind of like Ana Zen or Zen Mercy composition, something like this. So they've always got that option in the back.
Yeah, and also because we have such limited data, it could be maybe he underperforms in professional matches, but is looking great in scrims and needs that transition period. Like, we just don't know. Huck and Toronto Esports have a lot more data on this guy than we have. So you began to mention the coaching staff. You want to expand on who Krusty is and Shake and Minnie coming over?
Yeah, so Krusty was the coach of WNV Korea, actually, which was Kalios's old team, the Korean team that went over and dominated China. So he's got relationships with Kalios already. And then he came, after WNV Korea folded, he came back to Korea and built a team called RX Foxes. I think they were called NC Foxes at the time, with Neko and a couple of other upcoming guys from Korea, and they performed pretty well in Apex. They finished top 4. They were by far the weakest of the top 4 teams, and got slightly easier.
They got slammed too. In the third, 4th place match, they got slammed.
They got destroyed. But nevertheless, that is quite a good achievement from what was a fairly brand new team coming into it. And he showed that he knows how to build a system out of a brand new team, which is definitely what Boston Uprising are. They're a brand new team. They don't have a core. They have nothing really to build on in terms of existing synergy, other than a couple of players kind of knowing the coach. So I think he's going to have another challenge with Boston Uprising, but he's shown that he is capable of doing it to a certain level already. He's never been involved with a championship level team other than WNV Korea, which he came into kind of halfway through, didn't really build them. But he is a competent coach, I think, that will do pretty well with Boston Uprising, and we'll slowly see them improve throughout the season under his leadership, I think.
And we have a new coach too in Shake, who is a flex support player last for CLG, who's coming in trying to transition from player into that coaching role.
Yeah, which was quite surprising. Sheikh had been gone from the scene for quite a while as well. And when he was there, he was known as one of the more intelligent flex support players, I think, without having all the mechanical skill in the world, and didn't find that much success on a team. However, I think that he'll be pretty good at being able to break down um, micro plays that people are messing up, and being able to give that experienced player's perspective of what he can see going wrong with how they're approaching different attacks or how people are playing within the team, which is a valuable skill to have.
And then we have Minnie, who was the coach of Tempo Storm, so he was Dreamcasper's former coach. Again, this is a guy we probably don't know a lot about because Tempo Storm never really made a lot of waves in the scene.
Yeah, and actually, Mini was the guy that they tried to build the team around, or tried to build multiple teams around. Tempo Storm, and then was it Toronto Esports as well? I can't exactly remember, but I remember there were 2 or 3 rosters tried to be built around this guy, and unfortunately, they all completely failed. So hopefully, that's not a reflection of how he is thinking about the game and trying to put players into positions, and was just unfortunate circumstances. He's going to come from a player's perspective again, I think, and he's going to focus on. They've said in interviews he's going to focus on more of the micro, so like how people are taking individual fights and where people are supposed to be positioned, and crafting strategies. I think is something that Mini's going to be thinking, because he has a bit more of an outside the box approach, which is perhaps why a couple of the rosters built around him didn't work so well.
Well, he's got a lot of work to do, I think, with this. If that's his job, that's where this team needs the most improvement. So to wrap things up, where are we looking at this team right now? I think this team has like a huge amount of variance where we could see them because they already surprised us a bit in the preseason. So here's the thing. For me, if this team, we know they have the mechanical skill. If this team can get their strategy sorted out and show a lot of different plays and a lot of different looks, then I think their very, very unlikely high end could be 6th place. Like I could see them, if everything goes amazingly well, barely getting into the playoffs and then losing in the first round. I think like that's like the ultimate optimistic take of this team.
Honestly, I think as well that a more optimistic scenario could even occur if other teams completely fail. And I think there are a couple of teams that have been brand new built that have like the potential to be in the playoffs, but could completely flop as well. And so Boston Uprising, I think, are going to be one of the teams that are looking to capitalize on other teams utterly failing by building kind of a good fundamental level with their high mechanical skill, being able to execute on that. But I agree that a good result for them would be finishing mid-table for this first season.
Yeah.
And although I don't think that they will completely crumble, because it looks like at the moment they've got some kind of the fundamentals are there, even though they don't have all of their strategy down at all. But they've got the mechanics and they know roughly how to work as a team. And so I think that it would be unlikely to see them finish dead last or even in the bottom 2 spots, I think. But
I agree.
yeah,
I think 10th, 10th, 9th, 10th is where we should expect them to be.
Yeah, but again, I think there are a lot of teams that could fail a lot.
Yes.
A lot more spectacularly than Boston Uprising could, and which would end up elevating them upwards.
So we've done the very top end scenario. So the bottom end scenario for this team, the scariest scenario that I see, is that their strategy is so transparent. So the danger for them is if you watch the film from their games that they've played, you see how one-dimensional strategically this team is. And so my fear is that the more film exists on Boston, the easier it is for teams to beat them in the future, and their mechanics are not going to matter. So I think that that's like potentially their biggest weakness right now is if they continue to be, which we don't expect them to with more practice, but if they continue on the path that we've seen them in the preseason, that's going to release a lot of film. Teams are going to look at it, they're going to say, I know exactly how each of these players plays. I know where they're positioned on this map. It's over. Like, we just destroy them every single time, except maybe on control maps. So that's like, I think the biggest downside to these guys with me. And also, as we noted, so much of this rests on Dreamcasper's ability to play every hero if Striker and Mistakes don't diversify. So it's going to be interesting to see as metas change where they're going with their use of their DPS players.
Yeah, they should be a very readable team, even if they do manage to craft strategy, I think, because they're putting so much pressure on Dreamcast and also Gamsu. They're another team that's only got one main tank. And so how Gamsu plays and how Dreamcast, or how they put Dreamcast in position to play, is going to dictate a lot of just how the style of this team works. And so I think they're going to be pretty readable. For me, it's going to be a question of whether teams like Shanghai Dragon, Florida Mayhem, San Francisco Shock can actually
of course,
pick themselves up and improve on a better level than Boston Uprising. But yeah, worst case scenario could genuinely see Boston Uprising at the bottom, but I think it'll be somewhere towards the lower
9-10 would be my guess.
Yeah. Ninth sounds good.
9 sounds good. All right. Well, thanks for watching. Again, we'll have more of these Overwatch League team previews for each and every one of the teams, so come back and check out the channel.